Good morning, and you're welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar, which is brought to you by Teagasc in collaboration with the National Rural Network, Food Drink Ireland, SkillNet, and Dairy Sustainability Ireland. My name is Mark Gibson, and I'm manager of the Teagasc Connected programme. I'm also joined this morning by Pat Murphy, who is head of the Teagasc Environment Knowledge Transfer programme, and Pat will be helping us with questions later. Decarbonising of our environment is top of the European agenda, and Renewable Energy Directive has set out a target for all member states to have a minimum of 3.5% renewable gas used in heat by 2030. Today we'll be discussing the renewable gas and taking a look at the Mitchelstown central grid injection facility. And I'm delighted to be joined by Niamh Gillen, who is an innovation engineer, and Ian Kilgallen, who is a business development officer, both with Gas Networks Ireland. Good morning, Niamh and Ian. You're welcome to the Signpost series.
Good morning, Mark. How are you?
Great, great. And you're down in Cork, I believe. That's where you're joining us from this morning.
Yeah, both down in Cork this morning.
Very good, very good. And Niamh, if I could start with you, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing in Gas Networks Ireland, and maybe what's the connection to agriculture?
Yeah, so the work we are doing at the moment is, and I'll get into it in a bit more detail, but as a gas network, we're looking to decarbonise the gases which flow through our pipelines. And the area that myself and Ian are looking at is renewable gas in the form of biomethane. And the connection with agriculture is that the model that we are kind of most focused on at the minute is biomethane derived from agricultural resources such as slurry and grass silage. So that's where the link is.
Brilliant. And Ian, you're welcome.
Indeed, thank you, Mark.
You're down in Cork as well. Was your a Sligo man originally?
Sligo man originally. Yeah, I've been in Cork since 1987, but I still haven't got my citizenship just yet, I think. Yeah, indeed, we're both obviously working in the same area. So yeah, agriculture, it's unusual. We don't have any farmers that are actually on the gas pipeline, so to speak, that are consuming gas, but actually in the food processing sector, gas would be pretty dominant, for instance. So our largest customer base would be agri, food processing, dairy, beef processing, etc., etc. So obviously we're here to support agriculture in other ways.
In my introduction, I said that there's a 3.5% target there for renewable gas coming from non-fossil fuel sources, we'll say. What's, it seems to be quite an unambitious target, if I might say that. I know other countries do have higher targets. Where are we on that journey in Ireland, without eating too much into your presentation?
Yeah, so under the Renewable Energy Directive, so the European Directive RED II, there's, I suppose, a minimum target for all member states for the heat sector to be at a minimum 3.5% by 2030. So ergo, the national target of 3.5% is the minimum that's obliged in any event, if you know what I mean. But if you compare with our colleagues in France, so we do a lot of work with our French colleagues, God knows, they have a mandatory target of 10% by 2030. And indeed, they're actually going beyond that target. They have an unofficial target now of potentially 30% by 2030. And in their case, they're looking to be in an export position, so that they would be looking to export their renewable gas to other markets and other countries that will be further behind.
Oh, okay.
I suppose just to add there as well, from being that little bit behind means that we do have the opportunity, as Ian said, to learn off the best practices, where things went wrong, where things are going really, really well from our colleagues across Europe. So a little bit behind, but a lot of opportunity to grow is what we see.
Great. Well, maybe if you could share your screen with us now, and we'll get into the presentation. Just while you're doing that, Niamh, just remind people, if you do have questions for Niamh and Ian, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And today we are running the live transcription, which should be appearing at the bottom of your screen, but you can turn that off if you find it distracting. So Niamh, we'll hand over to you, and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Mark. And firstly, just on behalf of myself, Ian and Gas Networks, thank you to Teagasc for the opportunity to talk today at the Signpost series, and just to congratulate you on what has been a wonderful and insightful event so far. So today we're going to discuss renewable gas, why it's needed, how it's produced, and how a producer can inject into our gas network. Then Ian's going to give an overview of the Mitchelstown central grid injection facility and progress to date here in Ireland and throughout Europe. And then we'll just finish off with a piece on sustainability. So why does Gas Networks Ireland need to decarbonise its gas network? So climate change is the reason. It's the most urgent global challenge facing us today, and failure to address it is going to have repercussions for this generation and for generations to come. And one step that has been made in the climate change challenge is the move away from fossil fuels as energy sources. And fantastic efforts have been made here in Ireland, especially around renewable electricity, but gas is still playing a critical role in our energy system. So the gas network here in Ireland is a state-owned modern asset that's providing flexible energy to over 700,000 customers. And again, even though fossil fuel consumption has been reducing, the gas in Ireland is still accounting for roughly 1/3 of Ireland's primary energy mix and over half of Ireland's electricity generation, accounting for 53% in April. So when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, gas is a natural backup. So also, as I suppose, we're finding more of these frequent disruptive weather events as well, and they're becoming a lot more common. So it's important that we have a utility that's buried beneath our feet and that is rarely impacted by extreme weather conditions. That means we're ensuring security of supply as well when it's needed the most. So how do we retain such a vital energy asset for our country? So as the gas network, we are looking to decarbonise, as I said, the gases which flow throughout our pipelines. And we're looking at various technology solutions, but the one we're going to talk about today is renewable gas in the form of biomethane. And before we get into the process of producing biomethane, we're just going to take a look at the policy context which drives the need for such a solution. So if you've been to some of the other webinars in this series, you'll have noticed already that the European Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy have been mentioned quite a lot as important policy drivers. And this is true as well for biomethane. And with the Farm to Fork strategy, it calls anaerobic digestion technology out as a key technology to meet the reduction targets that are set within that strategy. The European Methane Strategy also recognises the role of biomethane in reducing methane emissions. The Renewable Energy Directive too is important for the production of sustainable biomethane, and they have sustainability criteria which producers have to follow. And finally, the Systems Integration Strategy recognises the role of renewable gases as being complementary within the entire energy system. So a European study has recognised Ireland as having the highest potential for biogas production per capita in the EU by 2030. So as a country, we're uniquely positioned to develop an Indigenous industry. Now, I know some of you here today might be familiar with the process, but for the benefit of those who don't, we might just walk through it. So organic material is fed into an anaerobic digester in the form of feedstock. This material is then broken down in an oxygen-free environment, otherwise known as anaerobic. Whenever the material decomposes, which is a natural process, it creates biogas. And as this decomposition occurs within the facility, the biogas is captured. But at this point, it's important to make a distinction between biogas and biomethane. So biogas, once created, its constituents is roughly 60% methane and 40% carbon dioxide, and also kind of trace other impurities. So in order to transform that into biomethane, we need to upgrade and clean it. So what that means is we take away the methane from the carbon dioxide. So once that has happened, we have biomethane. And this biomethane is it's a compatible substitute for natural gas, and therefore it can be injected into our gas network. So we have a carbon neutral renewable gas, and what that means is that the emissions that will be created once the fuel is burnt have already been offset by the emissions avoided throughout the process. So if you think of it kind of as like balancing scales, so the emissions burnt have been offset, making it neutral throughout in the process. So the gas can be injected either through direct injection or a central grid injection facility. And ultimately, the end product is a renewable energy source directly to the customer that requires no change in infrastructure and no change to their operations. And the optimum use of biomethane is for the hard to decarbonise sectors, such as heat processing and transport. Now, aside from the energy benefit of biomethane, there's also wider benefits that have been documented with the anaerobic digestion process, and they're mainly attributable to the agricultural sector. So one benefit is, I suppose, the digestate, which is a substrate, the remaining substrate of the AD process. And with its high nutrient value and its decreased methane emissions, it can act as a biofertilizer. And there's a multitude of benefits that have been documented with digestate research here in Ireland and throughout Europe. And it will be a key enabler for those EU reduction targets, such as the 20% reduction in chemical fertilizer. And also it may contribute to restoring soil health and the increasing of soil organic content. And as the benefits, these wider benefits exist within the agricultural sector, there's a unique opportunity for our food production companies here in Ireland, which is a vital source of revenue and employment for the country. So the majority of these food production companies need biomethane to decarbonise their thermal processes, but given that their supply chain is agri-based, there also is the potential for them to potentially harness some of these wider benefits as well. So in order for a biomethane industry to be realised here in Ireland, Gas Networks Ireland has a supporting role in where a producer is producing gas. Our role is to try and get every unit of gas onto our grid. So in some instances, this may be done through direct injection, and that is where an AD facility is close enough to the existing gas network, and it may be possible to construct a pipeline extension between the AD site and the network. Where that isn't viable, there is the potential to inject in a central grid injection facility. And what that means is that the biomethane produced on site is collected and transported via road to the central grid injection facility. So both options are viable, but they, I suppose, give different conditions for the producer to think about. So for example, with the direct injection, as you're directly connected, there's less moving parts. Maybe a little bit more direct control, whereas with the central grid injection facility, you have to consider logistics coming to your site, and that's just an example of the differences between the two models. But in any case, both options are extremely viable, and the option that is suitable for a producer comes down to their distance to the gas network. So I'm just going to pass you over now to Ian, and Ian will bring you through the Mitchelstown Central Grid Injection Facility.
Thank you, Niamh. So just to give you a bit of background, obviously, there are two primary ways upon which you can inject biomethane into the gas grid. We've direct injection projects, which at the moment we've about 60 inquiries we've pre-approved. But today I'm just talking about central grid injection. And central grid injection is to facilitate remote AD facilities on the basis that we can collect gas and bring it to a point for grid injection. So the processes are identical. The AD facilities in all cases are producing biomethane on site, but in this case, the gas is injected into tube trailers, and the tube trailers bring the gas to the network. We refer to it in the industry as virtual pipeline. Now, currently, the project here in Mitchelstown, it's just a short distance outside of Mitchelstown. We have actually secured full planning permission. The site, as you can see in the picture there, is adjacent to one of our existing infrastructure points and above ground installation. So the grey box to the right is the existing facility, and the site to the left, which is about 1.8 hectares, is the new facility. So we've, as I say, secured full planning permission. We're now in the detailed design phase. So over the coming months, we'll be concluding that. We'll be running our first workshop in mid-June, so whereby we'll be engaging with potential developers within the catchment area. So any interested parties, this is aimed at agri-sector, so agri-AD developers or potential agri-AD developers. This could be groups of farmers, it could be individual farmers, or it could be commercial developers as well. As I say, we're open for business. So you'll see at the end of our slide pack, we have a a generic email address. So anyone inquiring for both direct injection or for the Mitchelstown project can use that email address. Anyone specifically interested in this particular project in the Mitchelstown catchment, we'd ask that you include the word Mitchelstown in the header of the email. And as I say, we'll be looking to engage the first workshop in mid-June. The facility, it's a large industrial scale facility. It will, at full capacity, be able to support 20 plus, maybe 28 agri-AD facilities. The average size would be 20 to 40 gigawatt hours per annum. So in terms of feedstock, you're looking at AD facilities that will be taking in a minimum of 35,000 tons of gross feedstock per annum. And roughly speaking, about 50% of that needs to be animal slurry or other equivalent wastes. The 40 gigawatt hours obviously is about twice that, but that's kind of the upper limit as well for road collection of gas for central grid injection like this. You really wouldn't be building facilities greater in size than that. For direct injection, you can consider bigger. You can go double, 3 times or 4 times that size indeed. And some of the inquiries we're dealing with for direct injection are of much more substantial size. But it's a road movement thing. If you appreciate, we simply couldn't collect gas from a facility that big. You're better to try and locate closer to the grid if you were looking at that. Size-wise, as I say, at full capacity, this will be able to accommodate 700 gigawatt hours of gas. What that equates to is about enough gas to heat 64,000 homes. Or to put it more specifically, in the agri sector, that's enough gas to power, 4 large industrial dairy processing facilities, for instance. So the intention here is that we will roll this facility out in phases, over 3 phases. Initially, it will be for a 25% rollout. So in essence, we'll be looking for 6 to 8 developers to develop in parallel with ourselves, such that we're commissioning everything at the same time. And as I say, that process is starting now this year. Obviously, we will continue rolling out the subsequent phases based on the local demand within the catchment area. And as I say, it's hard to say exactly at what point in time we will be at 100%, but our target to be at 25% is roughly late 2023, maybe early 2024. So in timing, this means that this infrastructure and this project will be coming to market, I suppose, at a time that will be slightly later than the incentivization schemes that will be coming to the market. So I suppose those early adapters under the new incentive schemes will be mostly direct injection projects, but this project will be probably in scale actually very substantial and will probably make up maybe close to half of the total market under this initial target. So it's important to be slightly later than direct injection, and any developers that, as I say, that are interested in making an early movement on to get access to this early market, I suppose direct injection is your primary port to call. I might just switch to the next slide there, Neil, sorry. So this just gives you an outline of the project. As I say, that the main elements here is that it's a piece of infrastructure, a central grid injection infrastructure. You're looking at about a €20 million investment in total from ourselves. We have been shortlisted for co-funding from the Climate Action Fund. And if that proceeds through, then indeed we'll also be supporting 2 CNG stations. This would be commercial CNG stations for heavy goods vehicles. And that's a particularly focused market, so to speak. But obviously, the same facility could actually, for instance, be used to fuel biomethane tractors, for instance, as well. We, again, subject to the co-funding, we will also be offering a grant scheme to support vehicle conversion or new vehicle purchase for commercial fleet operators. If you want to switch on to the next slide there, Dave. So, here in Ireland, as people can appreciate, we're well behind our European colleagues in many respects. There are advantages to that, as Neil was describing there, but we're not totally behind. At the same time, we don't currently have any direct injection projects, funnily enough. Our only injection is an example of a CGI, a central grid injection facility here in Cush, County Kildare. Now I'll go into it in more detail later on, but the the interesting nature of this particular facility, given that it was constructed and commissioned back in May 2020 ahead of any national incentive scheme. So the biggest difficulties we had working with Green Generation in Lerny was to try and find ways by which they could commercially and viably inject biomethane absent a feed-in tariff, so to speak, or other incentive. And I suppose it led to interesting circular economy developments. And the best example I think that Green Gen have been able to demonstrate there is their contract with Tesco. So Green Generation have a contract with Tesco whereby they take in their shelf life expired food waste and things like that, but they also take in plastics, single-use plastic waste with fairly significant volume as well. The circular economy story there is that obviously the proportion of food waste that is supplied into the facility is converted into biomethane, which is injected back into the grid at Cush, and essentially Tesco are buying that then to run some of their vehicles on their commercial fleet. And interestingly then on the plastic waste that Green Generation is taking in, they're using that waste to produce products like motorway barriers and plastic bins, for instance, and things like that. So an interesting story, but obviously hard to replicate. So that's kind of a standalone story and you will see other examples like that, but for mass rollout, it's not, I suppose, it's not the ideal model to begin with, but it is an interesting topic, and as I say, fascinating as to how ingenuity can be brought to bear where incentives have lacked. You might skip on there, Niamh. Now, I won't go into this in too much detail. So we in Gas Networks Ireland are supporting rollout of CNG infrastructure. This is compressed natural gas filling stations, specifically for heavy goods vehicles in the commercial market. It makes obviously environmental sense for HGVs to come off diesel, and even just going to natural gas represents a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. You're looking at 30-35% reduction straight off. And obviously with biomethane, that brings it down to zero again. So that's obviously a distinct incentive. But commercially, it's very viable for heavy goods vehicle operators to convert. That it's 35% cheaper to run on natural gas than it is on diesel. The vehicle costs are more expensive. We have a series of grant schemes that we ourselves initially set up to support some of those fleet operators to convert. There are also now new schemes that have been introduced by the Department of Transport, and indeed if Project Raise goes ahead with the co-funding, then indeed we'll have a third support scheme there for vehicle conversions. But you might skip on to the next slide, Niamh. So just to kind of outline, we, Gas Networks Ireland, as I say, we're in the business, and everybody always assumes that we've been in the business of transporting methane, natural gas, but in reality, no, we've been transitioning through gas through the ages, so to speak. So gas networks in Ireland were established back in the 1890s, and originally running on what was referred to as town gas, which was a pyrolysis-produced gas, which was mostly hydrogen, actually, funnily enough. So hydrogen and carbon monoxide, and we transitioned to natural gas when the when the Kinsale gas field was introduced, and indeed when we built the interconnectors, we brought all of the remaining towns over to full natural gas, and that's back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s even. Now natural gas is mostly methane, so the transition from natural gas over to biomethane is an easy transition for us as a gas network operator. We don't have any infrastructure changes. Obviously, the new infrastructure required is injection plants and injection facilities, both direct and CGI, but chemically, system-wise and all that, it's actually quite an easy transition. So we could, technically speaking, go to 100% biomethane tomorrow if it was available, so to speak. Now, as we continue towards full decarbonisation out to 2050, there isn't enough biomethane that could be produced to get us to 100%. So hydrogen will play an important role going forward as well. It'll come in probably more closer to the next decade, really, just commercially, but you will see projects being progressed in this early phase. And indeed, blending, continuing to blend biomethane and also introducing a hydrogen blend, you will see more of that taking place into the next decade. And as we get out towards 2050, then you're looking at a gas network that will be running on both hydrogen and biomethane. And that can be done in several different ways, but it's a topic all in itself. So maybe I'll just hand it back to you there, Niamh. Oh, sorry, yeah, one more slide. Yeah, just to give a bit of background, as we mentioned earlier, yeah, because you can see Ireland right there at the very end. We've one biomethane facility here in Ireland, which is the one in Cush, and obviously well behind everybody else. I suppose, to our advantage, yes, we're learning from the best. So we ourselves are partnered with our French colleagues. Our colleagues in France are rolling out 3 biomethane facilities per week at this stage, and even throughout this whole COVID crisis, they never stopped to beat. Back in March of last year, they were at 2 facilities per week. The French government actually continued to give priority to renewable energy projects throughout the whole COVID crisis, so they really didn't lose anything on that, and they've now increased it to 3 facilities a week. France are, I believe, 4 years ahead of their target for 10% biomethane by 2030. They have well over 1,000 biomethane projects, and as I say, by the end of 2019, they'd commissioned 131 of them. So they're very much ambitious to continue this development. By the vast majority would be agri-based as well. And as I say, we have the advantage of working with our colleagues, learning from their design learnings and lessons. And indeed, a lot of what we're adapting is based on most of those French lessons. The only facilities we've been able to support commissioning as well have been in France. So we have engaged in some transfers and secondments and things like that over, again, pre-COVID. So we have, I suppose, the learnings built up, and we'd like to proceed at a higher pace. And obviously, we hope that this industry will take off in the coming years. And we're quite comfortable with this initial target. We feel, in fact, that it's probably something we can far overachieve on, if anything. So I'll pass it back to Niamh there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian. So in order, again, for our renewable industry to be developed here in Ireland, a key function is the certification of renewable gas. And a question we get asked is, why do we need certificates? So there are many businesses throughout Ireland who are looking for sustainable and indigenous fuel alternatives to natural gas, including our food processing companies. And this is because they need to decarbonise their carbon or decrease their carbon footprint and be more sustainable out into the future. So this demand has created a European-wide market of certificates, and they're already being administered in several European countries. And this will allow the tracking of biomethane throughout our gas network. So by providing an objective means of tracking of commercial transactions of biomethane, this will, I suppose, create trust and confidence within the Irish market. So Gas Networks Ireland registers and certifies and issues certificates to Irish producers who inject into our gas network. And the certificates are issued either as a guarantee of origin or a proof of origin. And what this does is it provides the end customer with a demonstrable use of a renewable fuel. So this leads us on to sustainability, and we might just use the Mitchelstown CGI facility as, I suppose, a context setter for what feedstock would be required at maximum capacity at Mitchelstown. So at maximum capacity, we would need 3% of current grass silage volumes and 5% of stored slurry within the catchment area. Now, there's been fantastic research done by Teagasc and other bodies within Ireland on underutilised land and underproductive land. So research is demonstrating that the grass silage required can be met by implementing better land management practices and without the requirement for additional land use. And in turn, the digestate, which is the byproduct of the process, can be returned to the farms and lands that were utilised within the process, allowing some displacement of chemical fertilisers and a reduction in spreading of slurry. And again, fantastic research done here in Ireland and across Europe, demonstrating that digestate application is given higher yields in comparison to slurry and to chemical fertiliser. Now, as we continue to support an Indigenous biomethane industry here in Ireland, sustainability is, I suppose, a concern that comes up quite a lot, and it's a concern that needs address. And the concern is mainly around, would the introduction of the biomethane industry here in Ireland upset, I suppose, the wider agricultural system? Would it upset the balance? So with this in mind, we commissioned a report with the expertise of KPMG Sustainable Futures Devonish Nutrition and their research farm in Douth. And also this report was supported by Teagasc as well. And what this report is doing is looking at Irish data on sustainable farming practices. Now, I'm not sure if any of you managed to attend the fantastic presentations that were given by John Finn of Teagasc, John Gilliland of Devonish, and also Helen Sheridan and Tommy Boland of UCD, where they discussed multi-species swords. And as our report is coming to conclusion, multi-species swords is also something that was becoming a bit, I suppose, an important topic in addressing a concern of feedstock versus fodder. And that concern of feedstock versus fodder has been heightened, I suppose, in the last few years, especially given the challenging weather circumstances such as drought. So the initial results from the research at Douth and the research across Ireland is demonstrating that multi-species are more climate resilient. They're demonstrating increased yields with decreased nitrogen input. And also, when used as a feedstock in the AD process, there is the potential for increased biogas yields. And this is aside from the other research on animal growth. So we are hopeful that this report and all of the fantastic research that has been displayed throughout the Signpost series will alleviate concerns of agricultural AD and also the agricultural system as a whole. And just before we conclude, we just want to touch on the farmer opportunity. And I suppose the opportunity and benefit from being involved in Agri-AD is mainly through diversification of income and income certainty into the future. And the means through which this can be achieved is feedstock income, lease income for the AD site, operator salary, digestate management, and also reduce costs of chemical fertilizer by utilising digestate. By implementing better land management practices to ensure that sustainability, there's potential for increased carbon sequestration and the potential to further reap any benefits that will bring. Economic ownership and dividends. Now to conclude, I hope that you all got something from this presentation today. And just to touch on the key points is that biomethane is an essential renewable energy to displace natural gas and ensure security of supply for our country into the future. It supports EU policy, and also as a country, we have a unique opportunity to produce an indigenous biomethane industry. Biomethane can help support the hard to decarbonise sectors and also agriculture. The process can and must be done sustainably. And in doing so, it would provide rural jobs and stimulate the rural economy and have a diversified income for the farming sector. So thank you very much. And as Ian said earlier, this is our email address, renewablegas@gasnetworks.ie. So if anybody has any questions or queries, feel free to note this down and we'll get back to you in the coming days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Niamh, and thank you, Ian, and thank you for staying on time. That was really excellent presentation. I learned a lot during that, I have to say. And you've obviously stimulated a lot of interest from our audience this morning, because we have a lot of questions coming in around the cycles that you proposed. Quite a few questions coming in around the whole food or fuel debate. And so one of our a question coming in from a colleague from France who is saying there is a big debate over in France happening about this rollout of digesters across the country, and how is this going to impact on our food security, or is this going to create tension? What's been the experience, Niamh, in that around the European Union, or indeed Ireland? I know there's been a lot of discussion around it. And particularly the north of Ireland as well. I know there's been that has come up in many debates.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, it's a valid concern, especially as climate change is bringing more challenging circumstances, especially for farmers. But I suppose we're looking at it more from a sustainability piece as a whole. And in order to comply with the RED II sustainability criteria, like production of grass has to be done in a fashion that doesn't disrupt the natural balance of the system. And we're very much encouraged by the research, especially around multi-species spores. And I mean, I know there's other reports that Chagas have done as well, just generally on underutilized land and underproductive land, and being able to incrementally increase. And I suppose we would have to find a point where there is enough incremental feedstock, and there would have to be a cut-off point as well. It would have to be done in such a fashion that you aren't diverting food away from the animal. But as I said, we do have a fantastic report coming out in collaboration with a lot of parties on this. And we're hoping that once published, we'll be able to alleviate a lot of the concerns around feedstock versus fodder in that respect. But the multi-species swords is definitely kind of the initial kind of not prize, but optimism whenever it comes to increasing the yields, having incremental feedstock, and having, again, that climate resilience as well going forward.
Yeah, the other thing to be aware of as well, obviously, it's an opportunity to address slurry management, nitrates issues and things like that as well. And you primarily have to focus initially on waste resources for a catchment area. For every AD development, it's animal slurry first, if you know what I mean. So the reason we picked the Mitchelstown location within that catchment area, there's quite a lot of farmers that are in derogation there, for instance. So it's an opportunity to address nitrates, derogation issues for one thing. Also, the AD process obviously alleviates a lot of the risks associated with using raw slurry for land spreading. Digestate itself in a raw form, it's 60% more nutrient content, so it's more it's more manageable from a land spreading point of view. It's more effective. It can be absorbed much more efficiently into soil as well. However, most of the developments that we've been engaged with our French and German colleagues in recent times and going into the future is not really looking at digestate as a product in itself. It's really an ingredient for the production of more I suppose, more useful organic fertilizers. So in reality, processing digestate is probably going to be part of the design spec, and also processing it, extracting the primary nutrients, your NPKs, and at least concentration it, if you know what I mean. So you're dealing with a product that can be certified as an organic fertilizer, can be in a form that's more easy to transport and also more easy to spread.
Do we know what the actual nutrient content of these digestates is, or is there a standard?
It all depends on the feedstock in, digestate out, if you know what I mean. So very typical, if you're assuming roughly a 50-50 split of, say, slurry and something like grass silage, you're looking at least 60% higher NPK anyway, just by that mix. And then if you are applying, say, like there's a few very interesting technologies we've been engaged with, and several parties are looking to bring them into Ireland, that can concentrate that into an NP and an NK, for instance. So you're looking at a concentrated form of NP and NK, and again, that can be further processed or further used as an ingredient for the production of more specific kind of bespoke organic fertilizers, for instance. So but as I say, it's case by case, and in reality, once you start processing it, it becomes a product. And I suppose where you have farmers then that are in, have a need for more NK or more NP, then obviously you have a product that can be designed to meet those requirements.
And just to touch there on the standards, so we can develop our own standard here in Ireland for digestate. There is no European-wide standard at the moment, but there has been, I suppose, signals from Europe that will be coming through the biofertilizer regulations. It's, I suppose, not overly essential for European standard unless we wish to trade digestate throughout Europe to have a CE mark for that digestate. But the development of standards is coming, and it has to come in order to meet those farm to fork reduction. I mean, the farm to fork strategy has a reduction of 20% chemical fertilizer, 50% chemical pesticides, and I think 20% increase in organic farming overall. So that is definitely going to stimulate some guidelines around digestate into the future as well.
Well, there's no doubt there's a tidal wave of policy on its way in this whole area. Just finally, from my own perspective, just on the practical aspects of this, a farmer presumably sells his or her slurry to an AD plant, and do they have the option then of buying back, or how does that actually work in practice? Because I'm just keeping an eye here on the nutrient cycling side of things, because I know that over the next number of years, there's going to be a lot of, as you say, pressure in terms of reducing our chemical nitrogen inputs. So how does that process work in practice? Because I know that, look, the whole economics of this area has been, maybe slow to catch up with the appetite to actually implement it.
Yeah, and the economics will vary by cluster, if you know what I mean. So if you take an example of a cluster of dairy farmers supplying slurry, there's really very few dairy farmers that are big enough to have their own facility and with just their own slurry. So you really are looking at let's call it a slurry cooperative almost for the dairy sector. You could be talking about maybe eight or less dairy farmers coming together, having the facility at one of their farms. So, direct supply into that. And then you've either a collection and distribution service then in the other direction. It's down to ownership as well. If this is run as a cooperative, then those farmers are also the owners of it. So you're buying and selling to yourself, if you know what I mean. But at the end of the day, commercially, there's a value, a relatively small nutrient value to raw slurry in itself, but there will be a more significant value to the digestate out. The business models we've developed have assumed a zero value, or sort of a net zero value at the moment, but in reality we believe, especially with the European Farm to Fork strategy, we believe there will be a commercial value developing on the returning nutrients, so to speak. If you take then, say, a dairy farmer that might be in derogation, so if they're supplying 5,000 tonnes into a facility, they're not going to be getting 5,000 tonnes of digestate back. They wouldn't want to anyway, because it's 60% higher nutrient content. So in reality, no, they're taking back what they need for their own land area. Digestate, especially in concentrate form, will be more valued for the tillage sector, for instance, as well. So you will be, in reality, supplying organic fertilizer out to a variety of farming sectors, not necessarily just the farmers that are in the supply chain of the feedstock, if you know what I mean. But at the very least, those that are supplying in slurry should at least get a nutrient equivalent back. It may not be the same tonnage, but a nutrient equivalent back. And the commercial arrangements is down to the individual farmers of the group, if you know what I mean.
That makes sense. Pat?
Yeah, I think Niamh has broken the record for the quickest bulk of questions and the most questions on a single topic. What happens to this 40% CO2?
Okay, yeah, so believe it or not, there is a very high market for green CO2. There's quite a few industries in Ireland, like, for example, the beverage industry and the horticulture industry that would utilize CO2. So where they can get green CO2, there's also value for that as well. If there can't be, I suppose, a source or a customer for that green CO2, again, whenever we talked about that life cycle analysis, if that CO2 is vented into the air, if there is not a customer, which, as I said, demand is very high for green CO2 for beverages, packaging, horticulture, where it is vented, it's already been accounted for again within that life cycle analysis. So it doesn't impact that end result of the carbon neutral renewable gas, because the emissions overall have accounted for that CO2 being released into the atmosphere. So you are still balancing out over the entire process, ensuring you have that carbon neutrality. And that carbon neutrality is a reduction based on the fossil fuel comparator. So for example, where a company or an industry would have used natural gas for their heating processes, the fossil fuel comparator is natural gas. So where you use biomethane, there has to be a 70% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions in comparison to that natural gas. So that's all accounted for within the life cycle analysis under the Renewable Energy Directive 2. But we are finding that the market for green CO2 is, there is quite a volume there for that as well.
Okay, two related questions then. Are there any concerns about leakage of methane out of the system? And are there any plans to capture more of the methane from landfill that's currently there?
Yeah, so
Might be
methane.
slightly off topic.
Yeah, oh, no, both related. Yeah, so methane slippage is what we would refer to there for both, actually. Yeah, so certainly the standard for biomethane facilities would be quite high. So the tolerance for methane slippage is very low. If you appreciate it commercially as well, it's not a good thing to lose that valuable gas, because that's what you earn your revenue on, if you know what I mean. Certainly, the methane slippage standards that we would be advocating would be a maximum 0.5% methane slippage. In reality, you can monitor these things, and a properly designed facility should not have any methane slippage. If you look at legacy biogas plants, you do get more methane slippage at those kind of facilities for a couple of reasons. One, I suppose they're prioritizing electricity production as opposed to methane production, so there isn't quite as much as an incentive to be as efficient, so to speak. Secondly, as well, because those electricity production facilities need to store gas, so there's a lot of gas storage. And at the end of the day, gas storage isn't good, and that gives you more risk of leakage. Whereas a biomethane facility, it's running constantly. The compressors are running constantly. You're either injecting into the grid or you're injecting into trailers. So it's not really hanging around long enough to become a risk in that regard. And the standards for the tube trailers and for grid injection is extremely intolerant of any form of leakage or slippage as well. So we're certainly very confident that methane slippage would be minimized. And indeed, it still factors into that life cycle assessment. So the design of a facility will have a methane slippage value. It has to be monitored as part of the annual audit process. And if there's any leakages or anything like that, it goes against the sustainability assessment. So it has to be made up for in the life cycle assessment. But given, if you think about it, you're primarily mitigating the significant methane emissions that would otherwise be occurring from things like animal slurries anyway, so you are indeed achieving a far more significant saving on methane slippage than would otherwise be the case, because if you didn't have an AD facility, all of that methane would be going to air in any event, if you know what I mean.
Look, a question here that points out that in relation to, I suppose, solar and wind energy, it's really been taken over by the corporates, and farmers really haven't been given a space. There's two kind of questions. Will Gas and Networks Ireland promote the involvement of farmers in this activity in the future? And the second one was, well, what is the experience in, say, France and Germany and some of the bigger countries where have farmers been involved, or is it predominantly corporate?
Yeah, look at biomethane, by its nature, agri-AD biomethane very definitively requires the farmers. It's a farmer business. There isn't really room for big corporates in this kind of model, to be honest. When I go over to France, the kind of typical models I've seen there, you'd have a collective, maybe 2, 3, or 4 farmer families coming together. They have joint ownership of these facilities in many cases. The model I like the most, actually, over what I come across in France, is where the families share the operation and running of the facility. So one family is running it for 2 weeks, it rotates to the next family and the next family. It's a really, really nice model, if you know what I mean. Now, as it's typically collectives, because there's very few farmers big enough to do this on their own as well. So it encourages neighbours and farming neighbours to work together, if you know what I mean, sharing both the feedstock, the running, and the benefits, and the digestate management, stroke organic fertilizer management. It's a model really that doesn't really suit a big corporate coming in to try and do it. Where there are exceptions in AD biomethane, it isn't in the agri space, it would be in the commercial waste space. So obviously the opposite applies to commercial waste, to be honest. So could a group of farmers compete with a big commercial waste operator? No, they couldn't. So trying to do an agri AD business based on a gate fee from brown bin waste collection in Cork City or something like that, you won't really be able to compete against the corporates that will be going after that kind of feedstock. But agri feedstock, absolutely not. It can really only be done by farmers and in farmer ownership.
Given, could I just ask a question, just following on from that, Ian and Niamh, around the investment that's needed to actually get these up and running? And obviously, there's a risk that anyone takes on with, setting up one of these plants and so forth. I mean, the price that somebody gets for their slurry or for their whatever they're supplying. Are there any models there, are futures or guarantees there to offset some of that risk that individuals or small cooperatives would say would need to take on?
Yeah, so I suppose we've been involved with KPMG in developing a few sample business models. We ourselves, Gas Networks Ireland, are actually prohibited from investing in and owning and operating any gas production facility ourselves, but to assist the development, yes, we have developed a few models ourselves, and we're also collaborating with the Teagasc research project, I think Project Fleet, for instance, also to see can other economic models be developed as well. But like I described earlier, there's going to be a multitude of different models that'll work for different farmer cooperatives, etc. The commercials, though, the primary consideration here is the gas. The revenue for the gas is your primary revenue stream. There will be other revenues that will develop over time, but primarily the business case is built around the revenue for gas, and it accordingly needs a guaranteed price. And what we're assuming in all of our models is it's a guaranteed price for 10 to 15 years, probably 15 years really being the optimum. The incentive schemes that are coming, and I won't go into detail here now because it's Action 57B in the Interim Climate Action Plan. It's talking about an obligation-based scheme. It's a bit complicated. We could hold an entire workshop to explain how it works, but in simple terms, an AD developer will be looking to tie an obligation party to a 15-year contract, ideally, maybe even longer, to be honest, and that the nature of that contract would be like a gas purchase agreement, essentially, would be needing to guarantee the price for that length of time such that you get a full return on obviously all of the capital assets invested into the project, and obviously cover all of your operating costs. The models we've developed are assuming an internal rate of return of up to 9%, 8 to 9%. It's in or around about that order. Compare that to, for instance, a solar or a wind farm development. They'd be typically 4.5%, 5.5% IRR. So we believe that's quite competitive, but obviously the market will also have a part to play in those prices.
The question here in relation to the kind of size you're envisaging. What kind of overall capital cost are you potentially talking about for that size of unit in a range?
So for a 20 gigawatt hour facility, you're looking at a capital cost of roughly 5 million, 5.5 million. For a 40 gigawatt hour facility, there is economies of scale, I suppose, whenever you develop an AD facility, and the capital cost is looking around 8 million. But I suppose there's I suppose 20 gigawatt hours is definitely what we would envisage as a farm scale AD. As you get towards a bit larger at 40 gigawatt hours, there is obviously more challenges, I suppose, around planning and things like that, because it's kind of tipping on industrial scale, not quite, but it's just a larger facility, brings kind of larger conditions as well. But that is kind of the capital costs that you'd be looking at for either of those size facilities. I don't know if you want to add anything, Ian, to that. Is that?
Yeah, no, that's the ballpark, and obviously that's today's money, if you know what I mean. So when we're talking about commissioning probably 2023, for instance, I'm sure there'll be inflation and things like that to consider between now and then, but today's money, that's kind of what you're talking about.
And I suppose, just sorry to add as well, that in regions, like for example in the Mitchelstown region, if there were to be 20 facilities, you would also, I suppose, get benefit from having one or two suppliers as well for your AD technology. Again, bringing in or having that kind of consistency across, again, could have some sort of returns for producers by not having 20 different type of AD plant and 20 different types of kit. So there is, I suppose, economies of scale to be brought there as well whenever there is farmers working in conjunction together. For example, a CGI or something similar like that.
Very practical question. Is the digestate sterilized, and is there any risk of swapping of diseases across farms if you're returning digestate?
So at these sizes, it's pretty well mandatory that sterilisation is required. I think within the rules, you could try and maybe find a way of avoiding it. If you had a really, really, really big farm and was you had all of that slurry all on your own, technically speaking, you might be able to avoid having to sterilise. But really, that's just not a practical example. So yes, either the slurry coming in has to be sterilised, or the collective digestate at the end has to be. And in reality, it's more likely the end process, to be honest, that would apply.
Okay, and there's a question here about your view on, and insight into short-term and medium and long-term feed-in tariff levels that might be available. I don't know if you're able to answer that.
Well, yeah, as I say, it's an entire workshop in itself, probably, and I'd imagine we'll be running workshops like that towards the end of the year, in particular, as there's clarity. So there'll be a consultation, for instance, later in the year, and fairly soon, hopefully. But in reality, yes, it won't be a feed-in tariff specifically; it's an obligation scheme. But largely speaking, it's very similar. As a developer or a group of developers will be looking to secure contracts with obligated parties, and the obligated party will be obligated to offer, as we say, certainly we believe 15-year contract is appropriate. If they go 10-year, for instance, then it will be 10-year at a higher price, for instance. Some may be even willing to go 20 years plus, to be honest. So, but you do need longevity, a long-term guarantee, and we'll see how this develops as the year progresses.
We have a question here, just I think from a consumer's perspective, about the future of the gas mixes that you're proposing there, that there would be more hydrogen and biomethane. Is this going to have implications for boilers or for people's homes?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. I'll go ahead here. So biomethane, no. Biomethane is a direct compatible substitute for natural gas. So where there's biomethane in the network, there's absolutely no changes to infrastructure or changes to operations, and is compatible at home. With the hydrogen blend, so hydrogen is very much, again, as Ian said, it's into the future. You probably won't be seeing an awful lot of that until the commercials kind of begin to stack up that bit better. So you're probably talking a decade or so away. We have a facility, an innovation centre in Brown's Barn in Dublin, where we are looking at, I suppose, those challenges of at what percentage can we blend, the implications for the end user, what infrastructure requirements, if any, and at what point do we have to make that change potentially as well. So it's all very much evolving at the moment, but it's an area we're working on, and it's an area that we and Europe are excited about as well. So that's all to come, I suppose.
Oh, it sounds exciting.
Question in there in terms of feedstock, is maize a viable feedstock? What's your view on it?
So within the calculation, it's a calculation methodology that you apply to your feedstock mix. And as I say, we apply generic terms, but then you have to follow that calculation methodology. And indeed, certain feedstocks, I think probably most feedstocks, you'd find a certain allowable percentage would be acceptable. Something like maize silage, which is a tillage-based crop, it probably would be a very small percentage, but nonetheless, it would be a percentage, or there would be an acceptable percentage in there. And again, you can balance it with, say, a higher waste origin percentage to compensate for a material like maize silage. But say perennial ryegrass or mixed species squads are easier and have less of a sustainability issue, if you know what I mean. So higher net emissions feedstocks require a balance at the other end. You need to compensate with more higher waste proportion, like more animal slurry. And at the end of the day, don't forget, more animal slurry means you need a bigger tank. You know what I mean? So it starts impacting your capital costs as well. So in reality, no. Yes, you can do it, but it will be limited to a percentage.
We have, I suppose, some questions coming in there around the I suppose the wider environmental impacts of AD and biomethane. We've talked about a lot about the carbon aspect, but what about water quality, biodiversity? We've had lots of presentations over the Signpost series here about the the need to develop more nature-based solutions to some of the side effects of agriculture, we'll call it. Has that been examined, that those other aspects?
Yeah, in particular, the use of digestate instead of the spreading of raw animal slurry, if you know what I mean, that in itself brings about significant benefits in terms of water quality, certainly. Every process can be run efficiently or less efficiently as well. I'd always caveat that, but in principle, you should be able to run an AD facility and manage that digestate in a form that's better to the environment, not worse. Obviously, something like mixed species swards have greater advantages as well. So the two things, as well, one is mixed species swards as a feedstock require significantly less nitrogen fertilizer. So you're looking at a significant cutback in use of chemical fertilizers. Also means the digestate you're producing, it becomes more viable to make it into organic fertilizers. It can go further, if you know what I mean. And the other aspect we particularly like about the mixed species swards as well is that the mixed species include quite a lot of flowering plants like your red clovers and your herbs and things like that as well. Now, they're the main ones, but certainly air quality, water quality in particular should be improved. And yes, there are some biodiversity benefits as well. Certainly it leads to net improvement. We don't believe it will lead to the opposite, if you know what I mean.
Okay. Look, we're just over time. Niamh, I know you have an urgent appointment to attend, so we won't keep you any further. Ian, thank you so much for your presentation and your contribution today. And look, really, I think we'd love to maybe get an update from you at a later stage, maybe more around that incentive side of things, because I think there's a lot of questions coming in around that. We've huge amount of questions coming in this morning, so you can see yourself there's a huge level of interest in this. So thank you again for your time this morning. Pat, thanks for helping with the questions today. And just to let you know that next week we'll be speaking to Dr. Anita Doheny, who is the head of species and land management with Birdwatch Ireland, and she'll be talking about farmland birds and the birds of conservation concern in Ireland. So we do encourage you to join us for that. So thanks again to our production team, Andy Boland and Yvonne Maher, and we will see you next week. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's that.